Thank you very much, Ingrid, and thank you very much, Joe, for inviting me, and to Brendan for persuading me to come up here. And it's great to be back in Donegal, folks. 45 years ago, I came up here to work in a little peat-fired power station up in Gweedore, and I'm sorry to say it was 45 years ago. So we're talking about energy policy in Ireland, and what do we think of energy policy in Ireland? And energy policy in Ireland, unfortunately, is a little bit incoherent. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense. It's not future-orientated. It doesn't have a rigorous intellectual framework to it. And most importantly, it has absolutely no imagination component to it at all. I see the world of the future as something like a shooting star. And the aim of business and the aim of countries has to be to aim your bow and arrow at that shooting star and to intersect it, so that you'll find your way to the future, because that future is happening in any case. And what is that future that's happening in any case? That future is about saving this atmosphere in which we live. Our species emerged with 270 parts per million of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. We've now crossed 400. A great Irishman called John Tyndall, working in the Royal Institution in London, figured out that if you passed radiation through a number of gases, if it passed through oxygen, there was nothing absorbed. If it passed through nitrogen, and they're the two main components, 98% of the atmosphere. But if you pass it through CO2 or through water vapour or through methane, the energy got absorbed. Well, we're releasing more than 10 billion tonnes of CO2 in the atmosphere every year. We're releasing the equivalent of 4 Hiroshima bombs, the energy content of those into the atmosphere every second. So that's the problem that we have to deal with. And if our energy policy is concerned with issues such as, competitiveness, for instance, great idea, but I mean, how important is it if the world is going to go this way? And with diversity of supply, and security of supply, which is another important thing. But if you miss the main thing, which is, are we going to be able to save this planet and leave it habitable for the people who are coming after us? Well, then we miss the whole point. And let's just begin by saying, when we set out 8 years ago in Mainstream, the cost of generation from various sources of electricity was warped. It was not understood very well. It was much more expensive than it is now. If you look at wind power has come down 55% in price since we set Mainstream up 8 years ago. If you look at solar power has come down 80% in price. Now I'm talking about solar PV. That's the direct conversion of radiation from the sun into electricity. And so now we're actually competitive with fossil fuels. Not only are we competitive with fossil fuels, but where we get to compare like with like, renewables are actually cheaper. And where do you get this? You don't get this in Ireland. Moneypoint, which I worked on, I was a sinner once, but Moneypoint, where I worked on, was built in the early 80s. And so that's 30 years ago. And all the power stations in America, the coal-fired, oil-fired, gas-fired, well, not the gas-fired, but a lot of those old power stations were the mainstay of America, were built 40 years ago. But in South Africa and in the rest of the emerging markets, they have to now start planning for the future. They don't have enough electricity. They're going to have to generate this stuff. And so, what are they going to do? In South Africa, they have 2 huge coal-fired power stations being built, and the cost per unit of electricity coming out of those coal-fired power stations is R1.28. We bid in the last auction down there for wind power, we bid 0.65, and we won. We weren't the cheapest, but we won. So we're coming in at less than half the price of coal with new wind. So that's where you compare new wind with new coal or new gas. If gas is below about $7 a million BTUs, which is the current measure of it, wind is competitive and wins every time. So, what about solar and what's going to happen to solar? Well, solar is getting cheaper over the next 2 years. It looks like it's going to come down in cost by between 16 and 20%. And every university in the world is studying it. And I've told you about the price. But in South Africa, the bid price the last time, in the last round of competitive tendering, was about 0.8 of a rand. And remember what I said about coal, it's 1.28. So we're coming in, between 60 and 70% the cost of new coal. And the question is, why would you not base our future on something that's really cheap and something that can really work. And, we meet skeptics all over the place and they tell us, well, wind is variable and solar is variable. You don't have any solar at night. So therefore you have to be prepared to pay more for baseload power. Well, there's another interesting phenomenon going on as well in the world, and this has a lot to do with the 20 billion that's being spent on electric cars at the moment. It's got a lot to do with Elon Musk in California, in Nevada, where he's building this gigantic new battery plant. The cost of, if you double the production of solar in the world, the price reduces by 24%. If you double the production of storage, electricity storage, the price comes down by 22%. So electricity storage is coming down at a rate something similar to PV. And as I said, since we set this company up, PV has fallen by 80%. So where does this leave Ireland? Well, Ireland has, under the, when Eamon Ryan was Minister of Energy, he got a paper from UCD which said you could go to 40% from renewables in Ireland. Well, I'm here to tell you that you can't do that. No island system with variable source supply like wind or solar can get really above 25%. There's a few countries that have done it, but they've done it because they have massive interconnection, like Denmark. Denmark is now at 37%. Germany is at 27%, but it's destabilising every electricity system around it. It's got 40,000 megawatts of solar and it's got 40,000 megawatts of wind at an enormous price, which the people there seem to be prepared to pay. Not the industry, but the domestic consumers prepared to pay it. So if we are going to try and do what we said we'd do, what we committed to in Europe, what's actually enacted in our legislation, if we're going to do this, we have to start thinking about, well, how do you do this? And there's two ways you can do it, but there's one main way you can do it to get us to 40%. And that's to interconnect heavily and far more profoundly than we've done with Britain, and for Britain to interconnect far more heavily than we've done, than has been done with any part of the continent. Interestingly enough, this is where big-time politics comes into it. I've presented both to Tony Blair and to Cameron on the subject. I know that Tony Blair brought it up with Mrs Merkel in Germany about a profound interconnection to allow those two countries to actually share. If you connect up an 80 million people with a 65 million people, the same spare plant that was covering for variability in customer demand and variability in renewables, the same spare plant will do you. And whereas Blair was prepared to go down this direction, Cameron was not prepared to do that. But we in Ireland are going to face big fines. We can't really get beyond 25% here. It won't be just Colin McCarthy that's given out about renewables in Ireland at that time. It's going to be the government will sit down and say, above 25% approximately, we're going to have to put in one new unit of gas for one new unit of renewable energy, and nobody's going to accept that, and rightly so. So we need to actually use a little bit of imagination when plotting this energy future for ourselves. We need to think, well, how do we do this? And how much are we going to spend on it? And shouldn't we have a national debate about it? Should we not have an educated civil service, which is going to say, well, what happened in Germany? What happened around the world? And what about cost? Now, and by the way, an interesting anecdote here is all the new generation that's been demanded in Ireland by these centres which process information. You've read about Apple coming to Galway and saying, we want 100% renewables. So all the big companies that are clued in to the modern way of doing business, all those big companies are saying, we want renewables. Whether it's Microsoft, in fact they're all saying it, even Google. Pretty primitive place, Google, but still they're doing that. I hope there's no Google people here, but freezing young women's eggs so that they can work harder for Google isn't my idea of fun. That's a little bit of spleen on my part. But anyway, that's the way the future is actually being constructed right now. And I don't see any attempts here in Ireland to try and intersect that future and to try and lead it. Ingrid, I think, said we might be short on resources here. Well, actually, we're not short on resources. We've got massive wind power. We are the darkest nation in the world. Yes, we are short on solar power. The name for Ireland is Hibernia. And what do bears do in winter? They hibernate. So the Romans didn't come near us because we're dark. So the future may not be so much with solar until the price reduces a lot, but we don't even need to think about that. We've got phenomenal wind resources here in this country. The whole of the western seaboard would have wind speed of at least 8 metres per second, which is absolutely tremendous. So if we're going to construct a future, we should do it. Wouldn't it be great to do it with free energy? You don't have to pay for coal. You don't have to pay for oil. You don't have to pay for gas. You don't have to be relying on American forces patrolling the Gulf to make sure that our sources of supply. We hate to be dependent on Vladimir Putin and his gas pipelines because they're unreliable, and we've seen the gas being cut off through the Ukraine. So where's the rationality? Where's the intellectual framework behind our energy policy in Ireland? And even more than that, where's the imagination? Just think about industrial development in this country. And I'm making these points in South Africa as well. For every megawatt that Germany builds in renewable energy, they employ 8 people. So that's a massive. You can actually construct a future, and when you're as rich in this resource as we are, you can construct this kind of a future. You can go to the big companies and say, we're going to build a big grid here. We're going to become specialists in storage. We're going to, tap into this huge resource that we have here, and we're going to start exporting it. Because when you look around Europe and you look for renewable energy, and you see a zero carbon emission scenario for 2050, and if we are going to keep the emissions in the globe to 450 parts per million, which amounts to a 2-degree rise in temperature, well, then we have to start thinking like this. It's just not an option for us not to do this. We can't be waiting for Germany to announce that, the rest, you shall do this. We should be enthusiastically embracing this here in Ireland. Members of the civil service and members of the political classes should be saying to one another, well, how can we actually, exploit this new technology in the interests of saving the atmosphere and creating jobs? There's a massive employment opportunity there for us. So I just, probably should conclude at this stage and look forward to hearing your concerns. We're a little bit too preoccupied here with looking at our navel and seeing, how many people are objecting to this, that, and the other thing. Instead of saying, well, if we were to do that, if we were to put ourselves in 2050 and look back and say, where on the road did we say we were going to intersect this shooting star of a future? And where did we use our imagination and say we're going to not rely on what we get handed down to us second hand from other nations and other thinkers? Why don't we use what we have out here? By the way, we've proved it in electricity. I borrowed £25,000 in 1997, along with 3 other guys. And we built a business, and we sold a 10% reduction to the ESB. And we made profit in the supply business every year, except for 1 year when the ESB monopolised the interconnector. But we sold that company for €1,800 million 11 years later. So, that demonstrated that there's big business to be done here. So it's, why wouldn't you save the atmosphere and save the thing for our kids and make good money at it? Isn't that a great vision? Thank you.